Can you make sound decisions that are fair?
So it's better transparency, clear KPI.
You're replacing a role traditionally fitted for one particular segment.
Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of Beyond the Headlines. My name is Amalina Kamal, your host, and as usual, we'll be going through the stories that made the headlines and more. Now, in this particular episode, we will be looking at the recent cabinet reshuffle in which Prime Minister Datuk Sri Anwar Ibrahim announced on Tuesday, December 12th. Now, the motivation behind Anwar's decision to restructure the cabinet comes at a time as Malaysia braves itself into the next economic year, fresh after celebrating its first anniversary recently. Now, Anwar's restructured cabinet now comprises 31 ministers, supported by 29 deputy ministers, which represents a slight expansion from his initial cabinet of 28 members, with assistance from 27 deputy ministers. Now, here we have a clip of Prime Minister himself explaining the need for a cabinet reshuffle. Let's take a look.
Keadaan juga berubah. Bukan saja berdasarkan prestasi yang lalu, tetapi perubahan-perubahan dari segi pertumbuhan ekonomi, permasalahan rakyat termasuk kos sara hidup yang harus ditangani dengan baik, juga penerimaan peringkat antarabangsa yang meletakkan tugas di Kementerian Luar Negara juga berubah. Kemudian juga isu-isu pendidikan tinggi, terutama dalam beberapa usaha kita meneroka beberapa bidang baru seperti artificial intelligence, digital transformation, yang menyebabkan saya memikir semula untuk membuat sedikit sebanyak penyesuaian melihat kepada keadaan dan tuntutan semasa. Maka setelah berbincang dengan ketua-ketua parti komponen utama, saya membuat beberapa cadangan dipersembah kepada Kebahaduli Yang Maha Mulia Tuan Ketua-Pertuan Agong dan diberi perkenan. InsyaAllah pada petang ini akan diadakan majlis angkat sumpah di Istana Negara hanya bagi menteri-menteri baru yang terlibat dari segi penyesuaian dan pertukaran jabatan tidak dikehendaki mengangkat sumpah. Jadi hanya menteri-menteri dan timbalan menteri.
There you have the Prime Minister Datuk Sri Anwar Ibrahim himself explaining the need for a cabinet reshuffle. But before I unpack the whole issue, I just want to introduce our guest that's on the set. Here with me to my right, I have Najmuddin Najib, our associate editor for the Straits Times. Welcome, Naj.
Hi, thank you. Happy to be here.
I'm glad to have you here as well. This is your first time on the show.
Yes.
How do you feel?
Yes, it is. I'm more comfortable behind the desk than in front of a camera, but we'll muddle through.
I think you'll be a natural. But of course, I also want to introduce our special guest, Dr. Tricia Yeo, who is from the Institute for Democracy and Economic Affairs, IDEAS CEO. Welcome, Dr. Tricia.
Hi, thanks so much for having me here.
I'm glad to have you here as well. Because today's discussion, we want to talk about the whole coalition dynamics that Anwar has led for the past year and also into the next few years, right? So to kickstart, let's talk about that in particular, especially whereas he leads a diverse coalition of parties. And in this recent reshuffle, I want to ask, do you perceive this cabinet reshuffle as a greater inclusivity?
Yeah, so I think this cabinet reshuffle was definitely a long time in the making. We were waiting for a long time. Many months, in fact, for this, and it's interesting that it comes just at the back of Anwar's own announcement that the ministries will now be given, KPIs, or there will be some monitoring and evaluation that will take place for the ministries, also at the states, right? So he talked about state governments as well. So in a way, maybe setting the tone for the ministers that are incoming to really buck up, and this will be closely monitored. But to your question on representation, as we know, Anwar leads a very diverse government for the first time, having coalitions of coalitions, a lot of different interests to manage to I suppose ensure that there are fair representation across the board. So in this respect, I mean, it's interesting if you look at the parties involved. I mean, in the previous cabinet, I think when you look at the party and the number of ministerships given to DAP, it was actually relatively low compared to the number of seats that they won in Parliament.
Right.
And I think the concession that was given at the time was that they were given more deputy ministerships. This time, if you look at the new ministers and deputy ministers, the new ministers, you have two new ministers from DAP, Gobind Singh and Stephen Sim.
Correct.
You have two new deputy ministers from DAP, Kula Segrin and Wong Kawo. And then from UMNO, you have one new minister, Johari Ghani, and then of course one deputy minister, Noraini Ahmad, and then one additional for PKR, Ramanan, and one additional for Amanah as well, Dr. Dzulkefly, who comes back as the Minister of Health, which I think many people have been welcoming. So it's just interesting to see like the balance of parties and which ones were given. For the three that were dropped, two of them were DAP, but I think it just replaces, right? So in the sense, Sivakumar is dropped, and then Stephen Sim comes in. Ram Kapal dropped as deputy, but then Kula Segrin comes in, and then Siti Aminah from UMNO is dropped as well. So I think the balance is quite similar, I suppose, to the balance that was struck in the previous cabinet. I mean, just to address this issue of the number of the cabinet, both for the ministers and the deputy ministers, yes, I think if you look at the total number of both ministers and deputy ministers, it goes up from 55 to 60. People do have a criticism about the fact that, are we going to have a bloated cabinet again, and so on. I think just 2 points to that. One is that I think even the sheet that you download from the government itself actually tries to mitigate that, right? At the very last point, saying that, this total is actually very low if you compare it to the 70 cabinet numbers that you did have in the previous administration. And then I think the second point is just that every time you have a coalition government, there are going to be party interests that need to be balanced out. It's always a negotiation game. It's always, number of members of parliament that we contribute to making the government work itself and being able to make concessions here and there. So I think, on the balance, it seems quite fair.
Right. I mean, it's interesting that you highlight that because, yes, we have had reactions specifically from MCA Youth as well as Muda, particularly on the cabinet now not being so lean as it was before this, right? So Muda in particular said that previous lineup performance was subpar and was chosen based on political interest. Now, in their statement also, they mentioned that, with this new cabinet lineup, there should be very little room for them to not perform. And just to echo MCA Youth reaction to this, because obviously Anwar's main takeaway when he came into power is that he doesn't want such a bloated cabinet, but you just mentioned about how he's more looking into how he can balance in terms of this representation that we see. However, another perspective in the criticism that we had is from former Penang Deputy Chief Minister 2, P. Ramasamy. Now, he specifically mentioned that there's not enough Indian representation. How do you see this affect the balance of power moving forward? I think he's referring to, Sivakumar being dropped as the HR minister and being replaced by Stephen Sim.
Okay, well, I think in the first place, the issue of using racial representation is always a tricky one. I do believe that in the interest of all Malaysians, it's ideal to move away from that sort of rhetorical tool. We are trying very hard to move towards a situation where anyone can represent anyone's interests. So it should be ideal that, me as a Chinese person who works in a public policy think tank, I'm not just writing about Chinese issues in the country. I'm writing about the interests of all Malaysians, and I would expect the same of cabinet ministers as well. So just because you have a Chinese person in the Human Resources Ministry, it doesn't mean that Indian interests will not be represented. If you have let's take the Prime Minister, for instance, right? The Prime Minister stands for all Malaysians. That is a position that's required of you. And even let's take a more extreme position. A party like PAS, for instance, that champions, it's a party based on religion. It champions Islamic values and principles, which in itself is by no means wrong. And you see that when PAS comes into a position of being in the federal government, which it was previously, it also has to moderate its views and knowingly being in the federal government, having to represent the interests of all Malaysians. So I think my first response to that is let's really try to move away from that kind of rhetoric and move towards representation of all races. Perhaps traditionally he's seeing that Human Resources Ministry is given to someone of a certain color, but I think human resources is something, again, that it represents Malaysians of all walks of life.
So do you think this could be like a watershed moment, sort of like testing waters for the Prime Minister in adopting this new mindset, whereby you have you're replacing a role traditionally fitted for one particular segment to another. Do you think that this is basically the first step towards many more?
I do hope so. I hope that this is a step that will not receive too much backlash, and I hope that if the backlash does take place, that the Prime Minister is able to stand his ground. And I hope this is the first of many other steps that would be able to break apart our stereotypes of, ethnic backgrounds being able to only champion a certain type of ministry and so on. Yeah.
I mean, I would love to see what Stephen Sim is planning to do. Not necessarily to address this predicament, but how Stephen himself is very PR friendly of sorts, right? So how he can engage with communities in which Ramasamy claims that him or his ministry now would not represent. So I would love to look into what he has in store for the next year.
Yeah, I mean, it'll be interesting. He's young and dynamic, and he obviously makes a lot of moves to reach out to other communities outside of his own and that he's comfortable with. So certainly, I think this really is also the challenge of future younger ministers, right? To move beyond what they are traditionally comfortable with, whatever their comfort zones are, and to be able to buy in and buy over and win over the hearts and minds of the others, which actually, if you extrapolate it more largely, is the challenge of all Malaysian leadership today.
I want to go into the HR ministry aspect, but I think we can still stick to the whole cabinet reshuffle first before we go into the HR ministry. How might the combination of, experienced ministers or experienced representative versus newcomers help in terms of, materializing these policy changes that a lot of our citizens are looking forward to for the next year?
Yeah, so I think the fact that you have two previous ministers who were in the PH 1.0 administration, Gobind Singh and Dr. Dzulkefly, that actually does help because, like it or not, when you're in the administration, experience counts for a lot. It's not just experience in the subject matter, which is a lot to deal with already because from my conversations with some of these former ministers, it took them at least 1 year, if not 2 years, all right? I mean, they didn't even have 2 years, but it took them 1 year to just really understand the issues at hand, navigate the complexities of the government service, the various agencies involved, and I think having that experience in hand is definitely helpful. That's one. The other thing is also to be able to maybe take that experience and share that with the younger, newer ministers who didn't have that benefit of, 20 months of being in government.
Right. So you think that this is at least Gobind's good advantage in terms of returning to the cabinet?
Yeah, I think that's an advantage. He was also, at that time, heading some of the interesting legal reforms, I think, within the communications ministry. So he'll be familiar again with the players. So it's also stakeholder management, right? Being able to understand the stakeholders in the industry. So that's definitely of value. But speaking of that ministry, I think the splitting up of the two ministries concerned, one was NREC, and then of course the communications and digital. I'm not sure what the thinking behind that was. Perhaps, Prime Minister Anwar did sort of preempt it by saying that there are a lot of new trends that the government needs to be able to deal with and manage. So maybe that's why you talk about splitting up of NREC. So you have energy transition and public utilities on the one hand, and then natural resources on the other. But I just have to say that the NREC specifically has undergone so many changes over the last decade. I do pity the civil service who have to manage this change.
You have anything?
Yeah. Okay. Gobind's new post, digital minister, right now. I think the PM went to great lengths to stress on the emphasis on AI. That should be under his portfolio again. It's interesting that we are finally giving attention to this. Finally, especially with the advent of like ChatGPT, Invastis, and all that. No? How do you think Gobind will basically steer everything in this direction with regards to AI and other digital initiatives?
Okay, so firstly, before we get to know like which issues are going to be under which ministry, I think it's important. So this is from a policy perspective. Like we want to see the official publication, excuse me, that defines all the various issues that come under the jurisdiction of each ministry. So this document is usually published, basically finding out what the punca kuasa is, right, for each issue. Coming to AI, now, of course, we know it's like, it's a completely new world. Where I think we can take a page out of is the EU. So the EU has just, after many months of deliberation, I mean, knowing how AI changes as well so rapidly, they have come up with an AI Act.
Yes.
So
first in the world. Right?
The first in the world. It will be interesting to see where the region, as in Asia and ASEAN, will take this forward. The same way that Asia and other regions also took a leaf out of EU's book when it came to the regulation of the digital economy. So there they had the GDPR, and then Asia is trying to do something like that. And similarly with AI, I think that's also where Asia can follow suit. And we need to, because these technological advancements are going to impact all countries in one fell swoop.
Back to the splitting of the ministries, like digital and communication ministry. Just playing devil's advocate here. There has been, if you follow social media, there has been a lot of criticism against the former digital and communication ministry regarding its sort of heavy-handedness approach to some criticism and stuff like that. No? And they've also been accused of taking second place with regards to cyber warfare, how the opposition has taken the lead with regards to furthering their own agenda, and all those things. And the ministry has been basically accused of not being able to catch up and just being more reactionary than proactive, right? Do you think this may have played a role in the splitting up of these roles, these ministries?
I think it's a lot on one plate if you were to put, I suppose, all expectations on one ministry. I think the original plan, of course, when you helm a ministry on communications, is that you're actually dealing with the communications and digital sector with all its players. And, I think even 5G alone is a lot to handle. And maybe the expectations for that one ministry to also be the government's mouthpiece. That probably was unrealistic as an expectation. But with regards to managing, all these players, right, social media, TikTok, and so on, I think there needs to be some more strategic thinking around how to manage what previously the party would have stood for, which is freedom of speech, right? But how do you balance the interests of freedom of speech with the need to also curtail what is now called hate speech online, with the fears that the hate speech could actually lead to more detrimental effects of harm within society. So there is a lot to take in, and I think this is where regulation can actually play a role, but you're not just talking about regulation for the sake of it. It's regulation that is smart, that is also transparent, and that is consistent. And what is it based on? I think in Malaysia we have a particular concern over 3R, right? Like the 3R issues. I mean, as someone who believes at least in classical liberalism, I think it's dangerous to ban things. I think banning will really set you on a slippery slope towards basically a country that can become very autocratic in nature. So what are the lines? I think determining what those red lines are need to be something that is discussed from government and society. But I would have a rather high threshold of what those lines are. And what those lines would be to me would be issues or statements that directly lead towards harming of the others. So meaning statements that incite violence, hatred that incite violence.
Right.
Yeah, because like I said, once you start going down that path of banning, then it really defeats the purpose of having any moral high ground to begin with. But I understand, I'm not the one there. I'm not the person in the hot position. So it might be very different if I were.
The person in that hot position is obviously Gobind, as he returns as the digital minister here. And I think that is particularly the critical area that he needs to look into when it comes to the digital ministries per se. But of course, I just want to also update on the whole community communications JCOM department has been placed under the communication ministry, a decision that was approved unanimously in the recent cabinet meetings. So now JCOM was previously actually under the communications and multimedia ministry, but it went under the Prime Minister's department, GPM. Now it returned back under the comms ministry. However, Fahmi clarified that despite sharing the same administrative umbrella, the outfits retain. The outfits are not, converging. Do you see that the preservation of these individual functions are reflective in terms of what Anwar is actually planning to do as well?
So I guess it's interesting that if JCOM goes back to the communications ministry away from the Prime Minister's office, what this signals is that he's also saying, okay, Fahmi Fadzil, you are in charge of the communications of the government. So in fact, it affirms that he needs to play that role of the mouthpiece of government. I mean, which is actually, I suppose, in contradiction to what we believe he should have been doing in the past. I mean, in the previous cabinet, of course, like I said, it was actually more to deal with the sector rather than speaking on behalf of government. But I think communication is something that people are very quick to use to criticize government's lack of performance. And I think if this move is being done, then there's going to be even higher expectations that communications will be smoother, clearer, and more consolidated.
How do you see the collaboration between Fahmi's ministry and Gobind's ministry?
I don't know. I mean, I think, for me, firstly, as someone coming from public policy and research, I always believe that policy consistency across administrations is key. It's key to ensuring investor confidence, to ensuring political and economic stability. So constant shifting of ministries, splitting up, combining, all these things are viewed unfavorably, in my opinion, just because it causes unnecessary delays in policy implementation. So you can imagine that for both these ministries, which are now 4 ministries, just getting the administration back on track to determine, okay, who's in charge of what policy area, that will take at least 6 months.
Exactly.
So it will be a lot of delays. Will the digital and communications ministries work together? I'm sure they will, just because of the baggage, that would have been inherited. How they will work together, we don't know yet. But I hope that there will be continuity. I think that's my main point.
Yeah, I just want to exhaust our discussion within the communications and digital premise here, just because especially under the digital sector itself, concerns on cybersecurity, even AI. But I suppose when it comes to Fahmi's ministry, it's more of the marketing, the exterior level, and then doing the operations would be Gobind's side. Is that what you're trying to say also?
Honestly, we don't know until we see the document that tells us the punca kuasa. Because who knows, like there may be issues that are actually split down the middle. But I think just by the name alone, it sounds like you're right, that Gobind will take the more primary policy issues that are more current in nature. So whether it's AI, cybersecurity, managing of digital platforms, actually that sounds to me like the lion's share of the sector. Whereas, I think Fahmi may be given the more traditional media sector then.
And it helps, I suppose. It puts Gobind on the front foot that he has done this before.
Yeah.
The 5G rollout. He was also a part of it as well again. So it's just a continuation of sorts. And he can actually hit the ground running again compared to some other people, right?
Yeah. I mean, I'm also interested to find out what happens. Well, I know the plans are already underfoot and underway with regards to the dual wholesale network. Gobind is someone who definitely understood the industry. So let's see what kinds of announcements will be made there.
Okay, I want to bring the discussion to the reshuffle. Also saw changes not just in the minister roles, but also replacement of the deputy ministers. So we have Siti Aminah Aching being replaced by Chan Foon Heng. Doctor, what implications might these changes hold for the respective ministry and their policy directions?
I really would prefer not to say this, but unfortunately, in Malaysia, the deputy ministers are not given as strong a role as they could play. In the ministries today, the ministers hold so much of a dominant position and powerful position that I sometimes wonder, what the deputy ministers' roles should be or are actually in reality. If you look at all the acts, for example, all the legislation, all of the acts will say that, okay, the minister has the power to make decisions as to this and that. The powers always go back to the minister. Everything reports back to the minister. Agencies, GLC, statutory bodies that are set up under these ministries all go to the ministers. So then the deputy ministers, I'm really not sure. I mean, if you really want to talk about bloated cabinet, not in this case, just because deputy ministers technically are not in the cabinet, I think questions would be asked as to like what roles the deputy would be given. I think largely they have played a ceremonial role, like to perform duties when the ministers are not around. But really in terms of policy direction, setting strategic vision direction for the ministries, I would like to see, actually, maybe this is something that we could ask for. Show us clearly what the division of labor is between the ministers and deputy ministers. I mean, surely there is division of labor. What does that look like for the ministries? And also, maybe this should come in when you're talking about performance. So not just performance of ministries as a whole, but maybe performance of the individual ministers and the deputy ministers. So in answer to your question, I really don't think that there's going to be major changes just because the deputy ministers have changed. I mean, the civil service obviously have to do a lot more hand-holding again for the new deputy ministers coming in, providing policy briefs for them on what to say, what the position of the ministries are. But in terms of setting direction, yeah, it really still lies with the ministers.
So perhaps moving forward, if one were to empower the deputy ministers more, maybe maybe a KPI change is required, perhaps,
Yeah, I mean, if they do have KPIs, I mean, I haven't seen them. I'd like to see them as well. Yeah.
KPIs being made transparent. Don't we all want that?
Yeah.
Okay. So talking about deputy ministerial roles, right? So we also have the appointment of Finance Minister 2, which is Datuk Sri Amir Hamzah Azizan, who has been appointed as the second Finance Minister, as I mentioned. He is, in fact, the second technocrat to be appointed to the Finance Ministry, following the footsteps of former Finance Minister Tengku Datuk Seri Zafrul Abdul Aziz. Now we have a clip of our Prime Minister explaining where the Finance Ministry is at and explaining his appointment of Datuk Sri Amir Hamzah. Let's take a look.
Well, my personal view, and I think I've built this general consensus, that the Ministry of Finance, other than being headed by me, must have a strong professional team to ensure that we are on the right track and focus on the economy and not to be sidelined or deflected by political pressures, right? And he has shown enough competence, ability, and has managed the affairs of EPF in a very impressive and satisfactory manner.
We listened to what Anwar particularly mentioned in terms of like being on the right track, so he needs a good team. How crucial is it for Anwar himself to balance his role as the Prime Minister and now Finance Minister, and having to also appoint someone who is very well versed in his field?
So in the first place, I think when Anwar announced himself as both Prime Minister and Finance Minister, there was a lot of criticism, us included. There was, the response was that in one of their previous manifestos, Pakatan Harapan had actually promised not to have the two roles in one person, just because it's bad precedence, it's bad practice, there's no, separation, and that there would be a potential conflict of interest there. So we know that at the time it was difficult for Anwar to appoint a finance minister from any of his parties within the coalition. Was there anyone who was credible enough within PKR? Possibly, but I think there was also this rivalry between himself and the Minister of Economy that's been quite evident. And then appointing someone from UMNO would have been perhaps a little bit controversial as well. So I think the market has been waiting to have this appointment of the second finance minister for a while now, just because it's quite impossible for the Prime Minister to be as hands-on as a finance minister. I mean, Prime Minister has his role. He has a very different kind of terms of responsibilities, right? We call it in corporate. And the finance minister has a different set of roles. So with the new Amir Hamzah being appointed, I think this is actually likely welcomed by the market, given his corporate background. Very strong corporate background, having been in TNB, MISC, and of course most recently EPF. I think he will also have to hit the ground running, just because there are so many things within the economy that actually need addressing. He will need to work hand in hand with the Minister of Economy, Rafizi Ramli, to address concerns including the fiscal consolidation efforts, which have been talked about for such a long time. What do we do with the fiscal deficit? Can we make sure that we roll out the newly passed Public Finance and Fiscal Responsibility Act very well? The Act has also been a long time in the making, just passed into law by Parliament this recent parliamentary session. And it's not clear yet, I think, whether the Act is going to be truly powerful in making sure that Malaysia keeps to its own fiscal discipline. So, I think we're looking forward to seeing what Amir Hamzah has in store. I mean, not just the fiscal consolidation side, but I think a lot of things with regards to that, including subsidy rollouts and removal of the price ceiling on chicken and eggs. All this has been talked about. All of this collectively will actually signal and boost market confidence. But let's see.
But I suppose one of the positives that we can draw from this is that it appears to be that the Prime Minister has listened to the criticism about holding the dual PM and Finance Minister role, right? And appointing a second Finance Minister to post. So I suppose it is, maybe we can see it as like an olive branch, a concession of sorts, towards that. But more interestingly, the appointment of technocrats to the finance minister role. Okay, this is the second time already, But how do you think this benefits the ministry as a whole? Is it really as it's touted to be? Having an outsider perspective of how things work, bringing a more corporate mindset into a bureaucratic setup.
Yeah, I mean that's a fair point, right? Because it's interesting. Just because you have experience managing a company, I mean, even if it's a big company, doesn't necessarily mean that you know what to do with the country's finances, because they're two very different animals. I mean, I speak from someone who used to work for Tan Sri Khalid Ibrahim at the Selangor state government. So I think there were a lot of equivalences being made, right? That he was also from the corporate sector, and then he went into government. So in the corporate sector, the bottom line is always a profit margin. Who are the shareholders there? And in the government, the bottom line isn't actually profit. So the bottom line is that, okay, you have shareholders, but the shareholders' expectations are actually very different. In the corporate, you want to save as much as possible so that you have a higher dividend to give out to your shareholders. In the government, you want to actually make sure that you spend money. So sometimes those, it's a very different point of view, and I think that was one of the criticisms of Khalid Ibrahim at the time. I think in Amir Hamzah's position, it will be slightly different because he was looking at EPF, which, it depends what, I mean, it's not really a corporation per se. The shareholders are also the rakyat. So
but
maybe
he was
that's
with MISC
similar.
and all that before.
Yeah,
so,
MISC before. I would venture to think that I think he can balance those interests well. But it would be different in the sense that, of course, the Ministry of Finance stands for the entire government administration. You're literally holding the purse strings of everything, right?
The government coffers,
of every policy implementation, every possible activity and program. So I'm sure once he gives his first interview, we'll know where his positioning is.
I think what's also interesting to see is that what other ministries can we perhaps expect technocratic appointments to be in? For example, is it possible to have, the MAS CEO one day helm the Transport Ministry, or maybe even the Maxi CEO, take on digital ministry portfolio? Do you think
that's actually really interesting. So I mean, you see, the more of this happens, then eventually the question will be like, okay, what's the point of a democracy? I mean, that's like the end point, right, of appointing technocrats into the cabinet, because then what you're saying is that, so now we have two technocrats.
Yes.
In the cabinet, Tengku Zafrul and of course now Amir Hamzah. So if, let's say, the proportion of technocrats to like elected politicians grows, what does that mean for the election process, representation, and so on? I mean, it's definitely interesting because you know that they would then have the experience. They know what they're talking about. But I guess on the other side of the coin, like, there will be some legitimate questions as well asked about, who gives you the right to speak on behalf of the people. I'm not saying that per se, and I think that the technocrats who have come in have done a good job, and they are likely to do a good job. But at the end of the day, I mean, who makes up the government of the day, I think is the question. But yeah, I mean, why
Understood.
not, right? MOT.
Do you think our Prime Minister is actually bold enough to make that decision? I mean, I'm sure he considered whatever you just mentioned, right?
Yeah. So actually, I have one more point to make about
Right.
just about that. Like, if you're coming in from the private sector and then straight away going into the position of regulator, there also can be a potential conflict of interest because your primary interest prior to that. So, take your example of being in the transport industry before and then going in to be the Minister of Transport. Likewise, say communications, going into the Ministry of Communications, you will still have links to your previous companies. This is why like a distance and a kind of space of about 2 to 3 years is actually ideal, although that's not very long because you still have those links. So my point is that can you make sound decisions that are fair? Is your judgment going to be impartial to ensure all players in the industry are treated equally? So that would be one concern.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Still on the topic of Prime Minister Anwar balancing his role and everything, but of course we also saw the reinstatement of Datuk Sri Joe Ghani in the Plantation and Commodities Ministry. How do you think he would, handle this portfolio now in this newly reshuffled cabinet, apart from leading the task force to resolve issues related to the 1MDB case? Balancing these two.
Yeah, so I think it's interesting to see Johari Ghani in the cabinet. I think based on his very active interventions in Parliament, the fact that he's given I would say, less significant ministry is something that I think he would have still accepted, just because it's an opportunity to be back in cabinet, he was in cabinet under the Barisan Nasional Administration, and it would be an opportunity for him to, I suppose, showcase himself. Balancing his role with that of the 1MDB committee that he's part of, I'm not sure how he will be able to prioritize both, given a ministership is definitely quite a heavy role and a lot of time would be taken. But I just want to say that I think this is also an opportunity for UMNO, but it still ultimately depends on the leadership, right? So I think Johari Ghani represents a part of UMNO that is more on the technocratic professional side, which is, partly what the party once stood for. So I would be interested to see how this appointment sits with the rest of the current UMNO leadership, of course the president specifically, and then also what this means for the future of this, once dominant party. I mean, a lot of it is out of Johari Ghani's hands, I think, but it's an interesting development.
But it is a significant ministry in the sense that you're dealing with plantations and commodities, and Malaysia has undergone some challenges with regards to the EU's palm oil issue and stuff like that, and he is known as a turnaround specialist in the corporate world, and so I think it will be very interesting to see what ideas he brings and how he steers Malaysia out of the current crisis, the palm oil issue. And he's already said when he was first one in, that some out of the box thinking will be required, to quote him. So
and also, I mean, Malaysia and Indonesia, the two world's largest palm oil producers, right? So plantation, as you say, plantation and commodities, it's a big role. It is a huge role.
Exactly.
I mean, many of the publicly listed companies in Malaysia are palm oil related. We are still very much heavily invested in that. And as you mentioned, the EU, palm oil is still one of the sticking issues between EU and Malaysia. One of the reasons that Malaysia has not yet been able to open up discussions on the EU-Malaysia FTA, which has been dormant for more than a decade now. Yep. So I would be interested to know whether Johari Ghani puts that in his agenda. So if you can resolve the palm oil issue, whether or not we can open up talks again with the EU on the FTA. And the EU FTA actually has a lot of deeper kinds of chapters on issues that Malaysia was able to dodge in the CPTPP. So chapters on government procurement, on state-owned enterprises, environment, which includes palm oil, In the CPTPP, we've got some carve-outs, right? Like 20-year carve-outs
Yes.
for procurement on Bumiputra provisions.
Mm.
But with the EU, I don't think those carve-outs are going to be possible, which means that if we're able to sit down on the table with the EU, bearing in mind palm oil issues are resolved, then it's an opportunity for us to reform our own practices internally, which also opens us up for more economic opportunities, meaning that you liberalize a bit more and bring our SMEs out to market. Yeah.
Yeah, this reform that you just mentioned that we're doing at present internally, do you think it is scaring away the investors, or it's actually investors are more looking at Malaysian politics to see that actually it's an active government that is exercising all these democratic thought processes?
No, I mean, absolutely, right? So democratic, institutional, economic reforms, all of these things are actually core to what the investors would look at when they're investigating which countries to go into. If we don't get our institutions right, our democratic processes, rule of law, I mean, many of them are already there, right? So Malaysia has very solid foundations. We just need to improve on those, and not to mention still a lot of human rights provisions that are still sorely lacking. And with the advent of ESG and business and human rights, I think the global market just cannot wait any longer, and Malaysia will still, will have to follow suit as well.
Okay, I want to go back into the HR ministry conversation.
Sure.
Earlier we mentioned about, Stephen Sim having the right kind of character trait to, push for the ministry and its policies. But is that enough? What sort of vision or, leadership Stephen brings to the table that Sivakumar did not have?
Okay, well, I wouldn't want to comment so much on Sivakumar himself. As for Stephen Sim, let me think. I mean, I think in the last few years, being an MP, from my observation, he's done a lot of personal initiatives, right, and engagements with his community, and a lot of them actually have to do with. Of course, with the poor communities.
Yeah, because on social media, he's active on helping the Bukit Mentajam community.
That's right.
Yeah.
On social media, helping his community. I think he helps students, and then access to laptops and things like that.
Right.
That's not. I mean, of course, I can't extrapolate that to what he will do in the Human Resources Ministry. But I'm just thinking that perhaps in the Human Resources Ministry, because ultimately what you're talking about is the labor market, right?
Right.
So you're talking about jobs, you're talking about wages. How do you work alongside Rafizi again to, perhaps get this progressive wage policy off the ground? A lot more discussion actually needs to happen. I mean, the progressive wage policy also, the white paper is passed, but I think I haven't really seen a huge public debate about how that's going to work in reality. So I think his heart would be in the right place. I can't make that extrapolation just yet, but if it's got to do with the labor market and workers rights and wages and increasing those wages.
And mitigating foreign labor now, right?
Mitigating foreign labor, yes. I have some other opinions about that, but I think he has actually a lot to deal with, because if you're talking about foreign labor, I mean, it's also trying to clean up, right, the mess that is with regards to the agencies. We do know that this agency market is some of it is a bit of a racket as well. So he has a lot on his plate. Yeah.
You're referring to the Bangladesh recruitment process and all that?
The recruitment processes, I think it's still quite shrouded in secrecy. I think that a lot more transparency is needed.
He's inherited quite a few legacy issues.
There are a lot of legacy issues within this ministry.
I think he might need to
not
work
just
closely with Home Ministry as well, because I do know that we do have that recalibration program 2.0 process for to mitigate these foreign labours as well.
Yeah, I mean, just because we're talking about foreign labour and migrant workers and so on, I mean, I do hope that eventually, not just this administration, but any administration will take a more open view of migrant workers, including the possibility of granting refugees the right to work locally. I think there is some discussion in the Home Ministry, but as you said, Home Ministry and Human Resources Ministries, those two ministries need to work really closely hand in hand to show actually to the Malaysian public that it's not a zero-sum game. There are a lot of jobs that Malaysians actually don't want to work in. So do we really need to get through this whole exercise of mitigating foreign labor? I mean, it could be that they're actually contributing to the industries that Malaysians, as I said, just simply don't want to work in.
That's on the whole human resource welfare area, but of course it also spills over to the public health concerns that we have now, and also the challenges in health environment that we see today. And with Datuk Sri Dr. Dzulkefly Ahmad's return as health minister amid concerns of rise in COVID, what do you think would be the key measures that his ministry should prioritize?
Okay, public health, there's just so many things. It's a laundry list. I think the two ministries that are always complex and challenging for anyone to deal with are education and healthcare. In healthcare, of course, number one, the rising number of COVID cases again. Who knows if there are other pandemics and other viruses that will come to our shores, hopefully not, touch wood. But he would have the experience already, I think, to deal with that. I think allocation of resources to the public health system, including the Klinik Kesihatan, so your public health clinics, as well as to hospitals. We saw during COVID how the lack of matching between demand and supply of hospital equipment was very difficult to coordinate quickly and efficiently. So how does that happen in the future, especially in times of emergency, right? When there is a public health emergency. The other big thing actually is the fact that Malaysia has a very significant proportion of our children that are undergoing malnutrition, stunting and obesity. Apparently the statistics, and I just had a lunch conversation with some people on this matter, are really quite stunning. Malaysia performs poorer even than some sub-Saharan African states with regards to children's malnutrition, stunting and obesity. So this is something that I think the nation really must address very, very urgently, because it means that our children are not eating the right nutrition. I think that we need to undergo like a huge overhaul of our eating habits. I mean, I think as adults we don't do very well either, but we should install some kind of a Jamie Oliver type revolution across
In
public schools and in the canteens. Make available proper nutritious food to the children, and please don't stock junk food. I mean, I have a small child who's going to go to school soon, and I plan to send her to public school. So I think
I
that's
still have
something to
memories
talk
of those
about.
chicken nuggets in school.
Yeah. I mean, chicken nuggets, at least there's some protein there, right? But you're talking about like chocolates and candies and like carbs. I think we're just a very heavy carb society, but children
Fried food eater.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
But we have sort of embarked on some way towards going there with regards to sugar tax, right? Which is which I think the the ministry said has yielded some results, So maybe a continuation of that,
Yeah. I'll be interested also to see whether he brings back the GEG on the table.
Okay.
Which is
I'm glad you raised that first.
Big subject of controversy. As you know, it was decoupled from the recent amendments to the Tobacco Act. So let's see.
But the GEG issue is an interesting one, because I think he has his work cut out for him, Dr. Zul. He was one of a big opponent of smoking, right? When he first came in, he was the one who set into motion the banning of smoking at all restaurants. There are no more smoking sections in restaurants when he was the health minister, and they just continued from there, right? But the removal of the GEG provision on the anti-smoking bill, I don't know, on social media at least, it is seen as a blow to the government's reputation on how strong or how aggressive it is against smoking, right? So I think he has a lot of damage control to do, right, with regards to helping the government restore its credibility and reputation on this.
this kind of policy change, regulatory change, law, legal change, it takes a long time because a lot of consultation is required, a lot of conversation. It's not just like, okay, the minister wants to do it, pass it to the AGC to draft, go to parliament and pass. In fact, that's not welcome either, because for anything, you require stakeholder engagement to understand what the issues are.
Otherwise,
and
you
if
just
you
do
rush it,
rubber-stamping,
if you rush it through, even the parliamentarians themselves don't have an opportunity to see things clearly in black and white and have an opportunity to engage, right? So maybe this is the right opportunity that is required for GEG to expand the discussion, bring people into the room and listen to all points of views.
But do you really think that it could be on the table again? I mean, yesterday he issued a million apologies over the failure to push the GEG forward, right? He said he was on the PSC, right, with regards to that, and said he was hampered by, and it was a thinly veiled jab at the AGC, I suppose, you know, and how is a constitutional issue, right? Yeah. But so is that really a reality still?
I think it is.
Really?
I mean, with him back, I mean, certainly, like I said, there will be an expectation for him to bring it back. And if he did a million apologies, then I don't know, show for it.
Right.
Yeah.
But there's also the issue of the contract doctors problem, right? Yeah, and that started during his time, but it just exacerbated during COVID, and Khairi Jamaluddin's time, right? Yeah. So it'll be interesting to see how this is coming full circle. Something that started there, and how.
Yeah, definitely. That's the other thing that I was going to mention as well. The contract workers issue. You know, many of the structural problems that were that became apparent during COVID-19 actually have not been addressed. They've just died down because other things came up. COVID eventually went away. I think these structural issues, this is the time, right, during a lull, to actually go back and address them and really put forward a solution that can be permanent in nature. But I think it also goes back to our public finances, right? So you can't address the contract workers issue without going back to how much the government is able to afford to pay. Our emoluments are already on the high side, not to mention the fact that we have a potential pensions crisis in the future. Our pension burden is very high,
of course,
in the country. So there needs to be a lot of discussion around what kind of reforms are required there.
But hey, we have Amir Hamzah now as the...
Yes, so let's see Amir Hamzah. Also, he's familiar, right, with retirement issues since he was from EPF.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, I mean, to wrap up, right, I just want to understand. I mean, we've gone through all the, I suppose, crucial ministries that we need to look into post the reshuffle announcement. But of course, moving forward, it's more of this approach that what the government wants to do and whether or not the public is, able to manage their expectations. So what do you think is the key?
When the government said that there will be a report card on the ministries, and it gave an example that was done by the Ministry of Housing, I believe, and what that report card looked like was actually, in my opinion, quite superficial. So it talked about things like, okay, the amount of houses that were built, or a number of millions ringgit that was allocated, dilapidated homes that were refurbished and things like that. I think really it's time for us to move beyond just a report card on reporting the various things that the ministry has done and spent on, but it should move more into what are the outcomes of this expenditure. We have already something called the outcomes-based budgeting. There's OBB, right? But what does the budget actually lead to? So has it led to, let's say take the example of the children that I mentioned just now, right? So the Ministry of Health, instead of reporting, Ministry of Health has spent X million ringgit on public health programs on food for children. Like, don't tell us that. Like that, okay, that's useful, but what is the outcome of that? Like, do you see improvements year on year in terms of children's nutrition, improvements in terms of stunting and obesity, more exercise being put in, physical, whatever the outcomes are. So that could be better indicators, in my opinion, of performance. And this would also help to overcome the perception that these kinds of report cards or, celebrating 1 year over 3 days, overcome the criticism that these things are performative in nature. So, in 1 year, in 2 years, but the problem also is that policies take time to change and also have a long lead time to take effect, right? So you spend money here, it takes some time for things to change. But that's what the term of government is for. So hopefully, if there can be that kind of political stability over a 5-year period, what have you done in year 0, year 1, that by the end of year 4, there are some marked indicators and some improvements for change?
I guess it is a tough balancing act, isn't it? Because when Anwar keeps getting criticized for the lack of speed in reforms, and yet you're trying to execute all these things, no? So it's a juggling act of like trying to placate this side and that side.
It's no joke being the Prime Minister of Malaysia. I do not envy anyone, and sometimes I wonder why people fight so hard just to get to that position, because there are so many multiple interests in Malaysia to balance. You not just have the typical multi-stakeholder approach, which every other leader in every other country has, which is to balance government, private sector, media, and so on. But in Malaysia, you have, let's face it, like different demands from different communities, different ethnicities, and that makes it much more difficult for any leader to be able to manage those interests. But having said that, this is why having a good team is really important. A good team to surround the Prime Minister, people who are very courageous to say things that are, criticisms even from the ground, good researchers, good policy people who know what they're talking about. And of course, this is where a good cabinet also comes in. We have lived under, scores of administrations in the past which are too highly centralized, too concentrated in the Prime Minister's office. We need to be able to empower from the top down. And of course from the bottom up as well. And let's also start talking about state governments, right? So where does the state come in? Where do the local governments come in? I think that's a different conversation, and I hope to see that happening. I don't know which ministry would be willing to do that, but if we want to talk about climate change, energy transition, and environmental, sustainability and so on, you need to start talking about state governments, because states control natural resources, including land, forestry, and water.
Excellent.
That's nice. So it's better transparency, clear KPI that you just mentioned earlier. This clear KPI will also be relevant to whoever is shouldering the roles, and what you just mentioned, the check and balance. The check and balance does not necessarily have to come from the external part, but also within his cabinet, just to recalibrate and reposition themselves in terms of how they want to reform. So Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim has faced formidable challenges, but what's certain is that his cabinet lineup stands as a testament to his bolstered control and influence. As we move towards the next year, it's very interesting to see how that would transpire. But of course, we're here to cover the developments moving forward. Now, to wrap up, I just want to also thank my guest on the show, Dr. Trisha Yeo. Thank you so much for coming, as well as Naj for sitting in this panel with me. For our audience back at home, if you like our show, please like and subscribe. Suggest topic of interest that you want us to discuss on. My name is Amalina Kamal. Thanks for watching.